Greetings, Ivy Artists. This is Miss A. Today I want to look at 3 artists who deal with identity in their work. Identity is a very, very popular subject for IB students, and it should be, because it's really such an important aspect of not only finding out about who we are, but also developing the different aspects of ourselves by looking at them, by coming to terms with them, and objectively looking at our relationship with the identity that we have. There's a storm brewing outside, so hopefully this will go well. Today I am planning to introduce 3 artists. They're all pretty well known, but I think sometimes it's a good idea to revisit their work in today's context, because artworks, especially those dealing with identity, can be relevant in very different ways depending on when we are looking at them. So the first artist that I want to introduce to you is Cindy Sherman. She's a very well-known American artist. The reason why I find Cindy Sherman very relevant is because her work spans quite a few decades. She was originally, I think, very much immersed and inspired by the second wave feminists, and specifically feminist artists like Hannah Wilke, Eleanor Anton, and Adrian Piper. Cindy Sherman's work mainly consists of self-portraiture using the medium of photography. She's basically known as the queen of selfies. Of course, her work is much more complex than that, because she really plays around with that idea of identity. The identity that she portrays or captures in her photography is very much malleable. It changes. She places a lot of significance on the presentation of the identity in the picture. So even though all the photographs that she takes are of herself, there is always a sense of performance. She is performing an identity, and the way she does that is that she uses things like makeup, she uses clothing, sometimes it's vintage, sometimes it's a reflection of some sort of stereotype. She also uses things like masks, prosthesis. It's interesting that she started off as a painter, but felt that photography was much more immediate, which helped her focus more on the conceptual side, because she didn't have to spend so much time on the painting. So her work is kind of described as a hybrid of performance and photography. She's taking photographs and she's also performing an identity in different photographs. So from that perspective, she asks a lot of questions about what identity is and how we arrive at the identity that we assume. She also perhaps asks questions about how that identity changes according to where we live, what our profession is, the company we keep, our age as well, etc., etc. So what is our identity actually influenced by? There is that element of emphasizing how transient or changeable our identity is, which is very, very interesting in the sense that we all know how we meet someone and we can pick up their accent, and this can be subconscious to get along with somebody, or when we travel to a different country and we live there for a while, for example, when we join a school, or we kind of go along with how things are done there. That can become your new identity, which sometimes becomes uncomfortable in the old setting. So there's this kind of idea of that our identity is definitely not fixed and that it's influenced by many, many things. Even though she does not necessarily see herself as a feminist artist, sometimes, artists are just like, I don't want to be pigeonholed, because their work is complex, and I respect that. But I think it's important to kind of pinpoint a few themes within the work. So for example, we know that she's influenced by a lot of feminist artists, or at least was at the beginning. And I think this is kind of re-emphasized by the fact that she does all her photography alone. So she's the author of the photograph, she is the makeup artist, she's the hairstylist, she's the wardrobe mistress, and she's also the model. So there's this idea of embracing this autonomy or agency or independence, if you like, of being the photographer and the model at the same time, which traditionally speaking, of course things have changed or are at least changing. Traditionally there is the male photographer working from a very male perspective, and then there's the female model whose job it is to somehow fulfill that or to kind of engage with that male perspective. And she's basically told what to do, how to look. She doesn't dress herself, the makeup is put on her, she wears the hair that she's asked to. So there's that kind of idea of not having that power to have an identity in some sense. The identity is dictated by the photographer or society or whatever is influencing what she's wearing and modeling, etc. There's also a clown series that she does, and also some of her recent photography can be hinting at the idea of women painting themselves clown-like to be seen as desirable and of hiding their age and the aging process. So that also kind of would lead us to think that she's simply working from a female perspective. So as I said, these are very much introduction videos. Her work is very complex, and it's just a way of me introducing these artists very quickly to you. So she's really interesting if you are looking at identity from a female perspective. She's definitely very interesting to look at. But in aspects of how we want to be seen, or how we judge others by what they look like or how they present themselves, I will quickly say that a lot of artists, or most artists, deal with adult themes, so you have to be aware of this. And I will also mention that there was a controversy. She did use blackface, I think it was in the 80s, where she got a lot of negative attention, let's say, because people were saying that it's an offensive stereotype, and they were particularly annoyed that there was not a lot of diversity when she was representing black characters in her work. So that's just something to be aware of. But I think, again, her work really brings up very, very interesting questions about our identity, how we present ourselves, the pressures of having to represent yourself in a certain way. So these are kind of the nuances and the ins and outs of how we present ourselves, what kind of photographs we take of ourselves, what do we want to reveal about ourselves, what do we want to hide about ourselves, how some images are empowering and some images are disempowering. That conversation between the person who is being photographed and the photographer. And in the case where you are the photographer of yourself, is there a disconnection between what you want to show the world and what is reality? And again, what is reality is another aspect of her work, because a lot of it has also these elements of fantasy, of escapism in a way. So again, looking at identity from many perspectives, and it's fascinating because at the end of the day she is taking selfies. But it's selfies at a whole other level, and it's really interesting to critically examine these ideas and look at them and make connections to what we are exposed to visually every day. Images of ourselves, images that we post, images of women, images of minorities, etc., etc., etc. So the second artist that we're going to look at is Yinka Shonibare. I hope I've pronounced that okay. And he is a British artist of Nigerian descent. The identity thread in his work is very much focused on colonialism, post-colonialism, and globalization, and kind of having these three interplay with each other in different contexts. That's his umbrella topic, if you like. One of the main materials that he uses in his work is the Ankara fabric, which is what basically almost everyone in the world thinks of as African textiles. There's a very distinct African textile that we all associate with Africa. The reason he uses this fabric or textile is because originally it is batik dyed fabric that originated in Indonesia and which was brought to Africa via Dutch colonialists. The reason this is such an amazing thing is because it talks about how a very strong identity of culture is actually a mishmash or a hybrid of many other cultures, many other circumstances, many different roots. This is such a kind of interesting and such a contemporary issue in society, this idea of having identities that are multicultural, multiracial, multinational, and it expands into all sorts of ideas of pure race and migration and all these global issues that we are looking at constantly in our daily lives on the news, and displacements of people and their heritage. And there's a contrast between this idealized identity where everyone is very sure, or somebody's very sure of their identity. You know, my parents are from there, this is my religion, you know, this is where I come from, this is my country, this is my heritage, etc. Contemporary world is very much not like that. People travel, people move, people are forced to move, people move for economic reasons because of wars, etc. You know, interracial marriage or not necessarily marriage, but you know what I mean. And this is not new, it is simply more prevalent or more obvious now. He's looking at identity from the idea of it can be really misleading. It is very much constructed or made up. Usually to make someone feel secure or safe or comfortable, or to identify with a group of people, a country, etc. And it's actually very fragile, right? Because of all the things that I've already said. It is something that is constantly shifting and changing. So after this Ankara textile was basically adopted by especially Western African countries, of course each culture contributed and changed the fabric in some way from its original form in Indonesia. So they adopted it almost as a formal dress of Africa, even though that's a continent. But you know, so it became a very kind of important way of also communicating various things because of the different patterns meant different things. So it's just a very interesting material to use in your work because it is so loaded, because it has so many layers and meanings. So some of the strategies that Shonibare uses is that he clothes his headless mannequins with this fabric, but it creates mainly kind of European historical dress pieces out of this fabric, the Ankara fabric, which is associated with Africa, to kind of again revisit some of the historical colonialist ideas, multicultural ideas. Most of the mannequins that he clothes are headless. He uses these to talk about how colonialism dehumanized people in order to do what it did, in order to divide Africa as property of different colonial countries, etc. Some of his work also reconstructs famous historical paintings where he is one of the characters, and again inserting himself as a black man. He's also incidentally disabled, and he's very active about fighting for more representation of disabled people, especially in the art world. So that's another kind of layer of his identity. And he inserts himself in these European historical paintings, again to look at this constructed identity. Who constructs an identity? How is that identity constructed? You know, if you construct your identity as a colonialist, what does that do to the identity of the colonized, etc., etc. In some ways, in that respect, he is a little bit like Kehinde Wiley. So kind of revisiting history and the depiction of Europeans and other people of different races or colors, or even genders in a way. So I would say that most of his work is installations. He has a lot of 3D work, so sculptures. One of his most famous one is Nelson's Ship. You should definitely look at that. That's a very interesting, very conceptual piece. And also, because of his disability worsening, he's increasingly creating work that other people have to execute. So his work is becoming more and more conceptual, which is again a reflection of who he is. So his work is very, very interesting because the strategies and the material that he uses, they're somewhat surprising, they're multi-layered, they're very loaded ideas that are approached in a very visually interesting way. The work has this multi-layered, multicultural, multi-perspective examination of identity, and again the constructed identity, how ideas of identity are actually made up in many ways, because once we scratch the surface we see that it's so much more complex than what it appears to be, or what people agree on, or what people agree to accept as an identity. So I hope I'm making sense, but basically it's a challenge to this notion that our identity is somehow pure or established or fixed. The last artist that I'm going to look at today, briefly of course, is Frida Kahlo, and she really doesn't need an introduction from me. And this is why I was really hesitant to include her, because first of all, I like to include or introduce artists that are more kind of contemporary based, possibly not known to everybody, even though I do always pick very well established artists. But I just couldn't get away from how important her work is. I have to say, when I was a young student, I didn't get her work. I thought it was really self-obsessive in some ways, but I think I just lacked the maturity to really understand how rich her work is, and this is why I've come back to Frida Kahlo. It is no coincidence that she has become an icon to feminists, to people in the LGBT community, and to people who are claiming or reclaiming their race or tradition or culture. For example, like the Chicanos, who were people from Mexico, who obviously still are made to feel inferior. So, she's such a prominent figure. And also, one of the other reasons that I wanted to include her is because she is very much a self-portraitist. She's a painter. Her work is basically self-portraits, or or most of it is. And the other thing is that even though it is quite traditional, you would think that traditional portraits are traditional portraits. But again, her work is really steeped in so many parts of her identity, including that she lived in Mexico, she's a Mexican artist, her father was German, her mother was a mestiza, I hope that I've said that correctly. And a mestiza is someone who is Mexican but with a European heritage or culture. This is my understanding. What I'm interested in, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but really what is interesting to me is this idea of duality. Interestingly enough, before she wanted to become an artist, she wanted to be a medical student. So she was heading that way before her accident. She's famous. And I think a lot of the depictions of, when she miscarried, and they're very kind of visceral and, lots of wounds and blood, and they're quite graphic. This was possibly influenced by her interest in medical aspect of the human biology and anatomy, but it also was very much a feminist move, portraying the female body. First of all, she is the one who is portraying herself, and portraying herself in brutally candid, very unattractive or unsexualized, if that's the word, portrayals of herself with, bleeding, miscarrying, etc., etc. This is why she has such an interesting take on the self-portrait. It is so much more complex than simply painting yourself in, the traditional way. There's so many other things that are going on. So I think in many ways her portrayal of herself, she's also famous for that, unibrow and sometimes a mustache. So this is again something that is interesting to feminist artists. This is what's so interesting about her. Even though her work was so specific to her, it was so autobiographical, so many people could relate and still can relate to her work. She's such a fascinating artist, and I think this is what I tell my students all the time. If you are honest in your work, whatever it is that you're doing, it doesn't have to be self-portraits. It's not limited to any specific subject, but if there is honesty in your work, you will always be unique and original. This kind of happens by default because it is specific to you. You are genuinely interested and honest about exploring that topic. So one of the things that Frida Kahlo was very influenced by, it was the Mexican pop culture. A lot of what she was looking at was folk art and Mexican traditional artifacts. And also specifically these retablos, I think that's what they're called, which were basically religious paintings, usually painted by amateur painters. So there's a kind of a naive flavor to her work, which was very much based on Mexican folklore. And even within that, there was this duality or clash of pre-Columbian traditions with the kind of very dominant Catholic culture as well. And you see this in her work all the time, that she refers to both. And again, there's that kind of discomfort between the identity being fragmented into different imposing influences. Another aspect of why her portraiture is not traditional is this kind of element of fantasy. Even this caused her to be a misfit in some sense, because although she was accepted by the surrealists and their art movement, she was an awkward fit. And really her work was much more to do with the magical realism. She was such a unique person, and her image really became almost like a way to assert her identity as a woman, as a unique woman, as a Mexican. A lot of what is incorporated into her paintings is also kind of based on pre-Columbian mythology. And this stubbornness with her identity, I think, became this almost like a armor for her to carve out this very unique niche. This is why her work is still so relevant. So Frida's work is very much very constructed identity, in the sense that she had control over how she presented herself, how she painted herself, everything including the iconic monobrow, the traditional Mexican dress. It's almost like a trademark, this kind of exotic persona that she created, and including all her passions and interests and autobiographical elements, everything from her pets to her miscarriage to her relationship with her husband. It's all there. Her struggles with herself, her depression, her chronic pain, the affairs she had, her political ideas. It's such a wide-ranging, all-encompassing narrative or story. So in some ways it is interesting to someone who wants to look at self-portraiture, but that self-portraiture is constructed on so many things, so many layers, that it becomes something very unique because it is so honest and because it is so widely explored in so many ways. So she's a great one, especially if you want to use traditional painting, traditional self-portraiture. She's a really fascinating artist who will always be relevant because, again, her story is so specific that it becomes like, a classic book. Everyone can see a little bit of themselves in different aspects of the work. And I think, again, this idea of such a unique identity created and controlled by the artist, who was a woman, someone with disabilities and chronic pain, a wife, a Mexican, a political activist. So again, the complexity of her is very much reflected in the complexity of the work.